Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Builders Project podcast, where we believe every person is a project that God is building. And I am excited for this conversation. With me today is Dr. Thomas Schreiner. If you do not know who he is in the theological evangelical space, you're living under a rock. He is a professor of New Testament interpretation and also biblical theology at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. That is where he is currently living in that area. He's been a key figure in a lot of biblical scholarship today. He's written in numerous commentaries, like the Baker Exegetical Commentary, and one of my favorite commentaries right now is actually the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary that I look to quite frequently. He's written numerous books, specifically The King and His Beauty on biblical theology. He specializes in the epistles of Paul. But today, and why we're going to be having this conversation, is he was a key figure on the committee for the CSB Bible translation. So I just want to say thank you, Dr. Schreiner, for joining me today.
Well, it's great to be with you, David. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. So the CSB Bible translation kind of, I would say, caused a little bit of a stir with the English language. We're blessed with so many different translations. So I kind of want to start with one. Why did Holman decide to do a revision? Because obviously that's where the CSB comes from. And how did you even get involved in this project?
Yeah, the CSB, as you noted, is a revision of the Holman Christian Standard Bible, which, of course, we have a new name, but it's a revision of that project. And it is published by, Broadman and Holman. And really, B&H Lifeway decided that the HCSB needed to be revised. I think the HCSB in many ways was really very good, but it had some idiosyncrasies in it. And there were passages that people would turn to. I'm not thinking of anything in particular right now, but they'd say, well, that seems a little strange and odd. And so I got involved because they asked me, and I was like, oh, yeah, that's really a great privilege to be involved in a Bible translation. So, I mean, anything else we write is hopefully important, but nothing's as important as the Bible itself.
Absolutely. And, I will say it was a little bit of shock in the Bible translation space for something like the CSB to grow so quick. From what I've seen on the bestseller list for Bible translations, the CSB has hit the top 5 or right outside of it virtually for the past 5 years. Why do you think that is? The CSB has kind of blown up even in it's been since 2017, only about 8 years now.
Yeah, well, I think it's honestly, I think it's because it's an excellent translation. It's clear, it's accessible. There's been some, let me just say, I think all our translations are good. I think the ESV is a very good translation. I think the NIV is a very good translation. But I think the CSB kind of occupies a middle space between those two. And some of what people don't like in the ESV and some of what they don't like in the NIV, the CSB occupies a kind of nice middle space. And I think people have said, yeah, there's some things in the NIV that I'm not completely happy with, or there's some things in the ESV, and no translation's perfect. We're always working on it. But I think people have said, well, yeah, the CSB is a nice kind of middle option between those two.
Absolutely. And that's actually how I got connected with the CSB in the first place. When I first started in ministry, I was a youth pastor for about 2 years. And during that time frame, I was sticking to the ESV like I've always taught and studied. And I remember doing Bible studies with some of my students, especially in the, I would say 9th, 10th grade range, or even the 8th or 7th grade range. And I would almost see a glazed look over their eyes. I'd start reading from the ESB, and I could clearly see there was a disconnection. And after talking with my students for a period of time, I began to realize they were trying to listen, but the vernacular of the ESV for them was hard to understand. And so I started researching Bible translations, and of course the NIV pops up. It's always been a popular translation. But coming from the ESV, I did not like how, I don't want to use overinterpreted, but I did not. I wanted to stick more true to the original wording, but still give clarity in those instances where the ESV wasn't clear or the syntax structure of the sentence. People like to call it Yoda talk, right? The ESV, which sounds beautiful, but for someone that doesn't have a hard grasp on the English language, or someone, we recognize that reading levels are starting to decrease. And so there's a greater need for people just to be able to read and understand the Bible clearly. And I really feel like the CSB has done a great job at that. But I do have a question. As you guys were walking through this project, what was the challenge of trying to balance that readability while staying faithful to the original text?
Yeah, well, and I want to first comment on what you just said, because again, I think what you said is helpful to reflect on. I think the ESV is a revision of the Revised Standard Version, which is a revision of the King James, and I think that explains why it's difficult often to understand for people. Now, it's not difficult if you know the Bible really well. If you know the Bible really well, you don't even notice it. Uh, but it is difficult, I think, for people who've never read the Bible, or for young Christians, or people who aren't used to reading the Bible. So, and then the second thing I to point out is that you said I think the NIV is a little more paraphrastic. I don't think it's a paraphrase, or probably a better way to say it is a little more interpretive. So, yeah, so our goal in doing the CSB was to be clear and accessible, to use contemporary language, but to be faithful to the original in a way. Like I said, we think the ESV and NIV is great, but in a way that we think was more accessible and a little more literal, if I can use that word, than the NIV.
Absolutely. And going back to, I guess, the question about the challenges, did you find that there were any challenges walking through these translation revisions, trying to balance the two? Like, were there points of contention between the committee, or did you feel like the Holy Spirit guided you in this process?
Oh, yeah. I mean, both are true. The Holy Spirit guided us. Yes, I feel that. But yeah, it's hard. It's difficult. We would never claim we've reached perfection. There's always more work to do. And yeah, we had lots of discussions, debates, disagreements. I disagree with some of the decisions we made. We voted as a committee.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, honestly, there were so many places where you face that I could hardly count them. But yeah, I think the Lord worked through it. But so one of the things that happened to me in engaging in this project, I became more sympathetic to every translation, because I realized doing it, well, this is not easy. Because, I mean, I'll just give you one example. Do we say in Luke, we have like 4 or 5 instances where it says your faith has saved you, but most of those are healings. Should we translate it, your faith has made you well? Which is, both those translations are right. But we actually went with the CSB, your faith has saved you, because I think Luke is actually saying in those stories it's both physical and spiritual.
Mm.
So, but it's hard, because if it says your faith has made you well, well, that's not wrong, right? So that's why it's challenging. It's not wrong to say your faith has made you well. So what's the best choice? And the danger of translating it, your faith has saved you, is maybe the reader won't see that physical healing is also involved. You see what I'm saying? So if you have saved, then you can think, yeah, there's a spiritual dimension here, but then maybe you miss the physical aspect. So that's not easy.
Yeah, I love what you said about being sympathetic. I used to be anti-functional equivalence altogether. I was like, no, you have to read, the KJV, or NKJV, ESV, NASB. And so I was just hard pressed on that until I was training pastors in Indonesia, and I had to have a translator for a training seminar. And I remember going back and forth with him. He's like, if I translated some of these words the exact way that you said them, the audience would be like, what are you talking about? And that's when I myself became more sympathetic towards the functional, because I was like, well, they're just trying to do their best to translate what I'm saying faithful to the meaning of it, while as best as possible staying true to the original word. And that's when I was like, well, that's what translation committees are trying to do, whatever the philosophy is. And obviously I know the CSB wound up on the optimal equivalence. That's kind of what the wording the CSB has used. But yeah, we have to recognize at the end of the day, there's no wrong way of translating a word, in the sense of, as long as it's capturing the meaning and the original word. Obviously there's a semantic range to be understood, but I appreciate what you said there about being more sympathetic towards different philosophies or different wording or translation words. What would you say? I mean, here we are now in 2025. The last revision was in 2020. Has the CSB committee as a whole thought about doing any other revisions, or do you feel solid on what the committee has come up with?
Oh no, there will be more revisions in the future. What we didn't want to do, though, is revise every other year,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, we will. I mean, we haven't set an exact date, but we did say something like 5, 6, 7. Well, it is 2025, probably 7, 8 years. You know, because there's always more work to be done. So yeah, we don't think we've arrived. There's more work to be done, and we don't have any particular plan yet, but I imagine that we probably will talk about that pretty soon, now that it's 2025. That's crazy. It's already 2025. So,
Absolutely.
uh,
And I want to say, this is my wife. I got her very first CSB Bible. So whenever I switched from the ESV, my very first Bible I actually got was a little leather CSB thin line Bible from Holman. And then I started preaching more. I actually ended up getting a CSB preaching Bible, which has the verses kind of indented. And then I was able to convince my wife to get me my first Scholar Bible for my birthday this past year. So I have my Scholar Bible. This is what I primarily use for preaching, teaching, personal devotion. And then my wife personally, for her birthday, I got her one of the new single column Bibles from Holman as well. It's a beautiful text, 10-point font.
no,
And
that's great.
yeah, it's a phenomenal Bible. And I will say, Holman, in just the past couple years, they have put out so many great study Bible options. I feel like every time I'm looking, Holman has a new, there's there's a traditional study Bible, and then I saw a counseling Bible, you have a life connection study Bible, then ancient faith study Bible, which I think is phenomenal. And so Holman's really taken hold.
Apologetics.
Yeah,
Yeah, apologetic study Bible.
the
Yeah.
apologetics,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so they've done such a good job of trying to reach people with the scripture in something they might be more interested in regarding certain topics. So I absolutely love the CSB. I did want to talk about, though, some of those translation choices. You mentioned that's the difficulty, right, of how do we render some of those words. So I wanted to start with one of the most famous examples, and that's how we translate the Greek word doulos. Now, I know in certain Bibles, I don't know if the CSB does this, they sometimes put in the preface a description of a reasoning behind. I do know in the CSB, the word is primarily translated servant. I believe in the ESV, it might be bondservant, and then, of course, in other renderings, which I think the HCSB does, is slave. I actually was speaking to a pastor just a couple weeks ago, and his favorite translation is the HCSB. And he said he actually likes the CSB translation, but he doesn't like that word translated as servant. So can you kind of bring me through the thought process of translating the word doulos as a servant in the CSB?
Yeah. Well, that is one of the things we discussed right away. And first of all, there are places where we translate doulos as slave, right? slaves, passages about slaves and masters, we clearly translate doulos as slave. But and a defense can be made for translating always as slave. But when we came to like Paul, at the beginning of Romans, say a doulos of Jesus Christ, you could translate that slave, but we this is where it's so difficult, because we said there's also a sense in which the that goes back to the Hebrew word ebed, which has the idea of you're a servant of God. And there are, I think, when Paul calls himself a doulos in Romans, it also has the idea of God's servant, not just slave. So I, again, I don't think that's a case where slave is wrong or servant is wrong, but what associations do you want to emphasize? You got to choose in English. And we thought, okay, that nuance from the Old Testament, that Moses is a servant, Joshua is a servant, because I don't think Ebed just means slave, right?
Mm.
And it's in Isaiah, it's the servant of the Lord. So really, that's our rationale, that you would miss the Old Testament background. Now, again, slave isn't wrong, but would you miss those associations with the servant of the Lord and the really servants of the Lord, right? In the Old Testament, where again and again, important personages are called servants. So we actually have, I think on our website, I haven't looked at this for a while, but we have I think a explanation of that particular issue, because that was a big issue. And you're exactly right. Some of the readers who loved the HCSB, they were disappointed that we didn't stick with slave.
Yeah, and that's the struggle with doing a translation is there's always someone that's not going to like it. It's almost impossible to please everybody. So at the end of the day, it's just being in a room together, trying to discern what the best case is. And I love how you brought in the Old Testament, because many times when people are reading the New Testament, especially that have a hard opinion that we should use the word slave, as you said, you're neglecting the range of meaning that word is used throughout the scripture. And I think that's a beautiful thing people need to understand, is by making a hard point on a certain word, in that process, you're also negating other meanings and understandings that the text is trying to communicate as well. And so I appreciate you saying that. One of the other words, which I'm sure you guys have discussed, is the good old famous word propitiation, which most people struggle to say in the first place. I know the CSB uses the phrase atoning sacrifice. So if you could also kind of walk me through why they decided to let go of some of the traditional word for that word.
Well, yeah, I'd say two things. First, look at Romans 3. We actually use the phrase mercy seat there.
Yes.
For hilasterion. And so we argue there that is the right rendering of that word. And actually, it's German, but that's how Luther understood it. The place where you receive mercy. We translated atoning sacrifice because we think that the word propitiation for most readers is not an understandable word. Now, again, you could use that word. I actually think in most cases where you have the word halasmos, you have the idea of wrath being appeased, but also sins being wiped away. So I think atoning sacrifice includes both of those. So yeah, again, propitiation isn't wrong, but I think atoning sacrifice, and we always have a footnote, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of footnotes to say, okay, here's another way of rendering it that we think would be right. But it's more in terms of accessibility on that issue.
Absolutely. And that's why I've always been a fan of the CSB. When people try and argue, well, yeah, but I think they should have done it like this. And, you guys weren't trying to hide anything. There are a plethora of footnotes in each Bible, which which explains, maybe when you're trying to give clarity, it'll say this literally says this, but for clarity purposes, we decided to translate it this way. And so that I've always been an advocate in that way. The CSB does not try to hide any of its translation choices, and many times it's sharing the plethora of options that could be available depending on that certain phrase.
Yeah, and I think one of the strengths of our translation is I think our footnotes are really helpful.
Absolutely. So this was actually, I watched a video. I watched pretty much every video available on YouTube about the CSB, and I was just trying to hear like the pros, and some people had some cons. And so some of these questions that I have were actually coming from other videos. There was actually one YouTuber that put out a video about how much he loved the CSB Bible translation, but he said his life verse apparently was Galatians 2:20. And as that verse has traditionally been translated using the word flesh, and in Galatians 2:20 it uses the phrase body instead. That Greek word I believe is sarx. But if you actually read through the rest of Galatians, CSB constantly translates that word as flesh instead. And so I actually wanted to ask the question on that specific verse, Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So I was wondering if you can actually provide clarity on that verse.
Yeah, that is a great question. I haven't heard that one, but so the word for flesh in Greek is sarx. That word can have a lot of different meanings, but sometimes, often in Paul, it stands for the unregenerate person, the flesh. So, but sometimes it just stands for your physical body. So we felt, look, when he says flesh in that case, he's not talking about who you are as an unregenerate person. And the word flesh could be understood that way. Paul often uses it that way, but often he uses it as well in terms of the body. So, yeah, we felt really good. I feel very good now in saying, the word flesh, given the way Paul uses it elsewhere, it could be misunderstood as referring to that unregenerate person. So, often, flesh is used in terms of your parents, your biological descent. Jesus is the son of David according to the flesh. Now we may have, I can't even remember, we may have said flesh there, but I don't think it's wrong to say body. I think body captures, what does Paul mean by flesh? I think he just means body there.
Okay, I love that. And that's why context is so important regarding these different translation choices. Actually, one of my favorite revisions I'm glad you guys did in 2020 was in Ephesians. You guys decided to go from live to walk. I guess, of course, the word live provides a little bit of clarity, but the traditional phrasing has been walk in Ephesians. So that's one of those examples where you couldn't go wrong with either or. So actually, in that translation switch, why did you guys decide to go back to the traditional wording there?
Honestly, I don't remember that discussion because we had thousands of discussions, but probably we said in this case, we wanted to stick with the biblical idiom because the biblical idiom helps you picture that the Christian life is a step-by-step discipleship process, or of course, walk can be used of your life before you're a Christian as well. So probably we just thought, this is a very common idiom and it's not very hard to understand. But like you said, live isn't wrong. I think the NIV uses live there. And I don't think it's wrong to say that, but I think we just, and that's where it's so delicate, right? I mean, wow, man, which way do you go? Maybe the committee, I won't be on the committee forever. I could see the committee in the future saying, let's go back to live. That wouldn't be a terrible decision, right? So
Absolutely. I only have a couple more of these because obviously there are so many we could go through, but these were just some of the ones that even stuck out to me personally as a reader. One of the examples, which I thought was very interesting, in the Old Testament, there is this common phrase, the Lord declares. In the CSB, I believe, decided to go the more literal route and actually say the Lord's declaration. And people have actually questioned that because the CSB, of course, is trying to be as clear as possible. The committee decided to go with "This is the Lord's declaration," and it creates almost like a choppy wording, which, in my opinion, I think that actually brings a better clarity to the passage because there's an emphasis on what God is saying there. But I do have to ask for a translation focused on clarity. Why did you decide to use "This is the Lord's declaration"?
Well, that is a great question. So I pressed the Old Testament committee on this very thing because it was our Old Testament guys, and their answer to me was, "Look, this is very emphatic in the Hebrew, and it's so emphatic that even in terms of optimal equivalence, we need to show that in the translation." So at the end of the day, I trusted them because I had that very same question. And I made the very same observation. I said, this seems a little choppy to me, so emphasizing it. And they said to me, here I relied on the Old Testament scholars. I'm a New Testament guy. And they said to me, hey, this is so prominent in the Hebrew. So that was their argument. So
I love that.
We went with it.
And that's funny too, because I believe the ESV, uses the phrase "the Lord declares." And so this is an example of just because it's a more formal equivalent, so to speak, doesn't necessarily mean it's more literal. So the CSB in this case actually takes the more literal stance in the rendering of that phrase.
Exactly. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's a love-hate. You go back and forth. But I love that about it. There's two other examples I did want to mention. One is in the Psalms. Let's just say Psalm 1 through 3. How blessed is the man, or how blessed is the one who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. The CSB renders that word happy. I'm going to be honest. The very first time I read it, it kind of shocked me just because blessed has been such a traditional word. I also notice in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, the CSB still uses the word blessed there instead of necessarily the word happy. So let's just say in the Psalms, which uses that word all the time, why did the CSB decide to go with the word happy instead of the word blessed?
Yeah. Again, what a great question. I think it's because the rendering blessed is a religious word that doesn't communicate clearly to the ordinary person. Now, in a traditional passage, so one of the things we did over against this HCSB, in traditional passages like the Sermon on the Mount, we actually said, look, in really traditional passages, we're going to retain more traditional readings, right? So we did that in the Sermon on the Mount. But I think the answer, and by the way, how to render that word from the Hebrew and Greek, that is not easy. Happy, I think everyone would agree, happy is not we don't have let me put it this way, we don't have an ideal word with which to translate that. I don't think blessed is an ideal word. I don't think happy is either. So we're doing the best we can because really we need more words, but we can't do that in translation. That's where we have to rely on preachers and teachers. So yeah, again, you could go both ways, but I think the argument is blessed is just not a word. Only religious people use that word,
That's true.
today. So I think that's the fundamental reason. So what's the best equivalent? You could say flourishing, but I mean, that's just not very accessible either,
Absolutely. And we all recognize in the 21st century, biblical literacy is at an all-time low. People aren't reading the Bible as much as they used to. So, with the goal of trying to be clear, I can see why, instead of going with the traditional blessed, it's like, okay, well, if they read the word happy, I think they'll have a good understanding of what we're trying to communicate here.
If I can tell you a quick story, a church invited me and they were deciding between the ESV, which I think is great, as I said, in the CSB. And I convinced them to go to CSB. And this is I think, what convinced them. I said, look, because these were the elders, right? I said, you guys, you have no problem with the ESV. You guys know the Bible so well. I said, you don't even notice it. But as I said to you before, I said a young Christian or someone who's never read the Bible, it's hard for them, you know? And I said the CSB is more accessible. So I said, for you guys as pastors, experienced Bible readers, the ESV is a piece of cake. But the CSB, and you see that with the word happy, it's more accessible, but still
Absolutely.
accurate.
Absolutely. And I'm actually in the process, hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years, I'll be planting a church here in Lakeland. And with full confidence, the CSB will be our translation of choice for the church. So I'm looking forward to walking with the CSB in that way. I have one more translation question, and I think this one, I am personally complementarian, but I know there's a large swath of Christians that are egalitarian. And so we go to famous passages like Romans 16. I know you specialize in the Pauline epistles. So when you get to Romans 16, verse 1 and verse 7, some of the other complaints is how, let's say, Phoebe or Junia, how they are described using the word diakonos. I know the CSB translates that phrase, at least in verse 1, as servant. And then in verse 7, it uses the phrase noteworthy among the apostles. Now, obviously, the CSB does have a footnote, which kind of gives a sub-rendering there. And so why did the CSB decide to, for my egalitarian friends out there, use the phrase servant instead of maybe the traditional word deacons or deaconess?
Yeah, well, I would just say I believe Phoebe was a deacon, but that is a very disputed issue.
Mm,
And there's two verses, 1 Timothy 3:11 and Romans 16:1, that possibly call women deacons. And there's a great debate upon that today. So I would just say for any translation, you just gotta, whatever way they go, you've got to cut them slack, because it. So I've been. I mean, if you searched, you could look at the Gospel Coalition, I think, and maybe other places where I've debated people on whether women were deacons, and I argue in Romans 16 and 1 Timothy 3:11 they are, and I think that'd be a good translation. But not everybody agreed. You can read those debates online, so that's just a matter of interpretation. I'd be happy with the word deacon in those passages, but it's very, very debated. Noteworthy among the apostles, actually, that that is a very good rendering, and that should not bother any egalitarian, because that's another way of saying outstanding among the apostles. Now, what that verse means still has to be unpacked, but there's nothing in that verse, the way we've rendered it, that speaks against egalitarians per se. So uh, it doesn't say, because other translations say outstanding in the eyes of the apostles, right? But our rendering says noteworthy among the apostles, calling Junia an apostle. So egalitarians shouldn't have any issue with Romans 16:7. Now I don't think Junia was an apostle in the same sense as Paul, but our translation our translation doesn't decide that issue. And by the way, we made that a principle. I mean, obviously, in some cases you have to decide, but we worked hard on trying to say, because we had Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans on our committee, Anglicans, Bible Church. We had a wide swath of people, males, females on the committee, different cultures. So we try, because we tried to represent. Hey, we're not trying to write a Baptist Bible here. We're trying to translate it well and leave vital interpretations to the reader.
absolutely. I love that. At the end of the day, what I love about the CSB is, as you said, you're not trying to write a Baptist Bible. I really believe the CSB is a translation that can be used with numerous denominations because it stays faithful to the text. And because, as stated earlier, it doesn't try and hide anything. I could tell the translation committee as a whole was trying to be as clear as possible. But also, at the end of the day, you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision how you're going to translate a word. And regardless of how you translate it, someone out there is going to say, well, it could have been better this way. It's kind of funny reading through commentaries. I feel like 20% of commentaries is explaining how it could have been translated because there are so many other options on how a word could be translated. And I recognize the tense situation of you guys trying to come to a conclusion on what would be best. I do want to point out one last thing, and I would say if I had to gather all of the so complaints about the CSB or things that they wish could be better, and even myself included, one of the most difficult things for people to let go is the poetic nature of biblical language. Of course, coming from the KJV, most people don't know what's happening, but it sounds beautiful. And so reading, I would say, some of the Psalms and, Song of Songs, one of the complaints is that it doesn't sound as poetic as we wish it could be. How would you address that, or how did the committee address that when they were coming to a conclusion about certain translations?
Well, I don't. The first thing I'd say is there's always room for improvement. You know, we don't want to claim that we've arrived. Of course, it's always hard to render the poetry of another language into our language. So, and I think there is probably in the traditional translations, King James, RSV, even ESV, yeah, there is a way that there's the more antiquated language in some ways fits poetry in some ways. So, but on the other hand, our fundamental value was to explain the text well. And hopefully, I think we have mainly preserved the poetic beauty of it as well. Perhaps part of that, at least, might be just familiarity with certain idioms that are become so part of our language. And of course, we all look back and think, the KJV was mainly William Tyndale's work, right? Yeah, he was super gifted, and he had a beautiful way of putting things, and that's been preserved in our English translations. And so, as I said at the beginning, we want to keep working at that as well.
Absolutely. As we start coming to a close, there's a few more questions I want to ask you, specifically in a practical sense. Let's just say there's a pastor in a church that they might be using the NIV translation as their primary Bible translation, or someone like myself that's been in the ESV space for such a long period of time. Why would you advocate for the CSB as a church maybe considering switching as their primary form of Bible translation?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd say is, look, the ESV and NIV are good. You don't have to switch. I do not say to people, you have to switch your Bible. That's not my argument. That's not the argument of the committee. We were committed from the beginning to saying the other translations are good translations. But then I would just say what I said before. I think the CSB, it's more accessible to the ordinary person than the ESV. It's less paraphrastic, I think, and maybe, and I should use the word interpretive because I don't think the NIV should be called a paraphrase, but it's less interpretive than the NIV. So I like that middle position. I think that's a good place for a church to land. So yeah, I would, if you're making a decision, I would definitely recommend the CSB, but I'm not going to criticize any church for using the ESV or the NIV.
Absolutely. You can't go wrong with either or. That's the blessed place we are as English speakers having the variety of translations. But I really do think the CSB does such a good job at bridging the gap between the two. Even as someone who, I made a 45-minute long video about why I love the CSB translation. And even as a native English speaker, I put it this way: sometimes when I'm reading the ESV, I feel like I have to translate English to English. Like, I'll read the sentence, and then sometimes I have to read it a couple times over because I'm just not getting it. And just the smoothness of the CSB, as someone who studies the Bible in my vocation, I just love how readable it is, both from a scholarly sense of diving into the Greek and Hebrew. And that's what I noticed as well. Even reading the ESV, I would go into the Greek, go into the Hebrew, and see, okay, this is what the translators are saying, but what do they really mean? And most of the time, my conclusion would be how the CSB actually renders that phrase and wording. So I really do think it's a great tool. And even when it comes to sermon application, a pastor doesn't have to spend as much time trying to, I would say, dig out the meaning of certain words, because the CSB lays it out so clearly for them. And so I am curious. Obviously, the last rendition was about now 5 years ago. What would you say has been some of the main feedback you have received from, let's say, churches, scholars, or readers of the CSB? Has the committee, has there been some feedback that you've seen that's been consistent?
Yeah, I would say, honestly, I think our feedback has been mainly positive. We've been very encouraged. So many people have said they'd like it. And then the kind of feedback where people have had questions is almost represented in all the questions you asked. There's a couple other kind of things. Some people wanted us to use Yahweh all the way through, for example.
And
But,
isn't that an HCSB translation choice, I believe?
but not all the way through. Not
Mm.
all. They just did it sometimes. Um, but honestly, we haven't heard a lot about that we didn't use Yahweh. That's a very minority view. But yeah, the kinds of things you bring up are essentially the kind of things we've heard. But mainly, I suppose we mainly hear from people who really like it. You know, so.
Absolutely. And I think as people begin to read the CSB, I know people are going to come to love it and enjoy it and see it as a great alternative from what they're currently reading. So, Dr. Schreiner, thank you for your time. So, what is, just a personal question, what is on the horizon for you as a theologian, as a professor, as someone who's written countless books and on numerous commentary series? Is there a specific thing of study that you are currently focusing on in this time?
Yeah, well, I have a commentary on Ephesians I just finished. It's coming out, Lord willing, from Baker. And the other thing I'd mention, I'm revising my book. It's not going to be a radical revision, but there's some good things out there that I'm including. I'm revising my book, The King and His Beauty,
Mm.
which so those are the two big projects I'm working on right now.
Absolutely. And to close off, last question, the purpose of this podcast is to help people build their life on Christ. Jesus says, those that hear my words and do them will be like a man who built his house on the rock. We're obviously entering 2025, and every single year there are new things that happen, cause anxiety, cause all of these thoughts and wondering about the future. As someone who studies the Bible, who loves Scripture, who loves God, what advice would you give for people going into the 2025 year for you? I know you have decades and decades of studying the Scripture, but if you had to give a word of encouragement as we enter 2025, what would it be?
Well, there's so many things I could say, but I just finished a commentary on Revelation, and I love what Jesus says. Don't be afraid. He says, I hold the keys of death and Hades. So if he holds the keys of death and Hades, he rules over everything. He's as he says, I'm the first and the last, which I think means he rules over the beginning and the end and everything in between, so we can trust him. And that doesn't mean we won't go through hard times, but he's going to be with us. He's going to strengthen us. He's going to keep us, and we're ultimately going to triumph. So we ought to be of good cheer as we come into this year, and there's daunting prospects in this world, but don't be afraid. God is with us. Christ is with us. We ultimately triumph, so we should be cheerful, happy, optimistic, not not Pollyannish, right? But we recognize there's great suffering as well, but there's no reason to fear.
I love it. Thank you for that message. Thank you for your time, Dr. Schreiner. It's been awesome being able to pick your brain. I know there's so many other questions we could ask, but I appreciate the work you've done on this translation, the work you're continuing to do for God's kingdom, and just blessings for you in this continued season of nonstop study, I'm sure.
Thank you so much, David. Great being with you.